Hi there, Johannes Keating here. Anxiety regulation. So I see a number of people try to regulate anxiety in the patient when it's not necessarily clear that the patient is needing that. Now, if the therapist is needing to do that to regulate their own anxiety, that's valid because the therapist's anxiety also needs to be within an optimal window. It can't be too high or the therapist isn't going to be able to do effective therapy. But it is a misconception to think that the patient should not be experiencing any anxiety and that you should be sort of fixated on regulating it as soon as you see signs of it. In fact, the opposite is true. You want the anxiety to be there because that's the only way that you'll be able to eventually increase the tension, the interpsychic conflicts that lead to more tension, and eventually that interpsychic crises and the tipping point and the scales of power shift to the UTA dominating the resistance or the avoidance. And that only happens with anxiety being mobilized. And so anxiety, if we're doing standardized TDP, is a very good thing. Now, it's true, we also don't want it to be too high. We don't want the thought processes to get disrupted and disorganized in any way. And so, of course, there's a time and place for anxiety regulation. But by and large, there seems to be a trend where people are over-regulating anxiety when that's not necessarily what's needed in terms of the patient. If the therapist needs to do it, so be it. So there's that. The second thing that's on my mind about anxiety regulation today is this thing about stepping outside of the moment and creating a kind of add-on special project to regulate the anxiety. And that could be encouraging the patient to do all these physical things, which can be very effective. I'm not trashing that at all. But it's these physical things, pushing like this, squatting, the heels, the calves like this, or this sort of hyper-educational piece where the therapist becomes a lecturer and really lays it on heavy with psychoeducation, sort of throwing the ISTDP textbook on the patient as a way of trying to regulate the anxiety and explaining all the ins and outs of the channels of unconscious anxiety discharge and so on and so forth. And the potential downsides of those approaches are that you can easily step into shoes, unbeknownst to you, where you can become sort of this PE teacher, physical education teacher, gym teacher, if it becomes about this physicality stuff. And you can become another person lecturing the patient when you go into this hyper psycho-ed. And again, sometimes that's absolutely effective and the right thing to do, so I'm not knocking that wholesale. But I'm inviting you to consider the potential risks and downsides of going into this sort of add-on special project. Takes you out of the moment. You can easily step into shoes. And lastly, it isn't necessarily all that helpful for the patient to learn about all the ins and outs of ISTDP metapsychology. Like if that was going to be helpful, they could just read a book about it and they wouldn't need you necessarily. The alternative is to stay more in the moment and to review the process, asking the patient to look at what's happening in their bodies, providing a little bit of psychoeducation around what's feeling and what's an anxiety reaction, and oops, your anxiety got a little too high and you became dizzy, and now let's take a step back and just take a breather, and can we look at what happened and how we got to this point, with soft invitations for the patient to reflect on the whole process and to look at their emotional reactions towards you. So to me, that keeps you in the moment. It avoids the downsides of becoming a lecturer or a PE teacher, this whole sort of special add-on project. Again, I'm sure that can be very helpful and it gets the job done, but there are these potential risk factors of going that route as opposed to the more natural and organic route where you then can facilitate insight and regulate anxiety at the same time. So that way you're more experience near. You don't step out of the moment into this special project, but instead you stay in the moment, review the process, thereby typically regulating anxiety and facilitating insight at the same time. So it keeps the work more experiential even as you're regulating anxiety. And that will be all for me for today. Thanks for watching. Till next time.